In 1993, the biggest modeling agencies in the world pushed a very specific kind of beauty, glossy, traditionally feminine, built to sell fantasy without unsettling anyone. The supermodels who dominated that era didn't just wear clothes. They sold permission, a narrow idea of who you could become if you bought the right things. It worked because it was familiar. Then, a sculpture student raised in the Scottish borders turned up for a British Vogue shoot with no agency machine behind her and no appetite for being softened for the camera. She'd tried the standard route, go-sees, castings, the quiet rejection loop, then walked away and went back to art school. British Vogue wanted a colder, more local kind of image for its December portfolio, and she fit it. Her name was Stella Tennant, and when someone asked her to remove the septum ring, she stayed exactly as she was. By the time the shoot was over, the industry had its new contradiction. An aristocrat who dressed like a punk, a reluctant model who became a muse, a woman who would move for decades between runway lights and a private life in rural Scotland. Until that crossing finally asked for more than she could give. Stella Tennant was born in 1970 in London, into a family whose name carried weight long before she did. Her grandmother was Deborah Mitford, Beau, the Duchess of Devonshire, and her mother, Lady Emma Cavendish, grew up inside that world. On paper, that kind of lineage reads like a straight path into society life. In practice, Stella's story keeps pulling away from the paper version. But the version of her childhood that shows up most consistently in profiles and tributes has less to do with Chatsworth than with the Scottish borders, where she grew up. The borders are quiet, rural, and far enough from London or Edinburgh to feel like their own country. Farm life, open land, rolling hills that change color with the seasons and winters that test your patience. The kind of place where your bloodline matters less than whether you can keep chickens alive through February. Tennant was shaped by both worlds, the ancestral estate and the working countryside. But when she later described herself, it was Scotland she reached for first, the land, not the lineage. She went to art school. Specifically, she studied sculpture and fine art at Winchester School of Art, part of the University of Southampton. She wanted to make things with her hands. Three-dimensional objects, not two-dimensional images. The medium mattered. Sculpture is about volume, weight, the way light falls across a surface you've shaped yourself. It's the opposite of modeling, where someone else decides how light falls across you. Before fashion found her, she'd already tried the conventional modeling route. Go-sees in London, the standard circuit of casting calls where young women present themselves to agents and hope for a callback. It didn't work. She moved on. Not dramatically, not with any public declaration. She simply returned to her life. This matters for the story that follows, because it means her entire career began after she'd already decided modeling wasn't for her. When it came back for her, it came back on terms she hadn't set and couldn't have predicted. There's a photograph that lives somewhere between these two identities. Bruce Weber shot Tennant alongside her grandmother at Chatsworth for Vogue. An ultimate family portrait, Tennant later called it. The Duchess in her domain, the granddaughter beside her. Two women separated by half a century and an entire cultural shift sharing the same frame. It's a useful image because it captures the tension the fashion world would spend decades feeding on. Tennant was aristocracy and anti-establishment at the same time, and neither side of that equation was performed. In late 1993, British Vogue pulled together a December portfolio that leaned away from Polish and toward a sharper kind of British cool. Stephen Meisel shot it, with Isabella Blow involved in assembling faces that didn't read like agency perfection. The portfolio is remembered as London Girls, and it landed at the exact moment the industry was starting to reward a look that didn't try to please the viewer. She fit that shift without chasing it. Tennant submitted what she later described as passport photos to be considered. Not a portfolio, not composites from an agency. Passport photos and the kind you get from a booth, unretouched with flat lighting and no styling. She was on holiday in the Scottish Highlands when the call came. She took the sleeper train down to London, an overnight rail journey that deposits you, slightly dazed, into King's Cross Station at dawn. There's something about that detail. The overnight train. The arrival from the Highlands into a gritty East London shoot, that sets up the rest of her life in miniature. She was always arriving from somewhere else, somewhere quieter, carrying a different version of herself into the frame. She arrived with a septum ring and no interest in sanding herself down for the room. The team expected her to remove it, and she didn't. Meisel understood immediately what that meant. This wasn't styling, it was identity, and the momentum hit fast. By the next day, he had her on a second job, this time for Vogue Italia in Paris, and the new face period basically ended before it began. British Vogue's own tribute, written after her death, described her as a British aristocrat with a septum piercing and a haughty stare who approached fashion with nonchalance. Even as subjective praise, that language is revealing. The fashion establishment didn't mourn her as a beautiful woman who'd posed well. They mourned her as someone who'd refused to make herself easy to categorize, and who'd been rewarded for it from day one. 3 years after that Spitalfields shoot, Tennant's career underwent its most consequential shift. In 1996, Karl Lagerfeld, the designer who had spent the previous decade rebuilding Chanel from a fading heritage label into the most powerful luxury house in the world, signed her as the brand's new face. She was replacing Claudia Schiffer. In the hierarchy of 1990s fashion, this was seismic. Schiffer had been Chanel's public identity for years, one of the most recognizable women on the planet. To replace her was to change what the house meant. That replacement was a statement. Schiffer represented the Chanel of the late 1980s and early 1990s, blonde, voluptuous, warmly glamorous, a woman whose image promised abundance. She was the Amazon, the word The Guardian's obituary used, a figure of confident, traditional femininity that had driven luxury marketing for the better part of a decade. Tennant represented something the mid-90s fashion mood was actively seeking, a cooler, leaner, more ambiguous kind of beauty. The Guardian framed the switch in exactly those terms. Lagerfeld wanted a face that read as modern in a way Schiffer's no longer could. This was a corporate aesthetic pivot executed through one casting decision. What the public saw as a new muse, the business saw as a rebrand. Lagerfeld went further. He publicly stated that Tennant reminded him of Coco Chanel herself, the house founder, the original rule breaker. Tatler reported the comparison. Major posthumous coverage repeated it. Whether the resemblance was genuine or constructed is almost beside the point. What matters is that the house wasn't just hiring a model. It was using Tennant's image to rewrite its own mythology. The Coco comparison said, Chanel has always been this. The septum-pierced aristocrat from Scotland is our origin story, updated. The Scottish connection added another layer. Chanel had a documented history of incorporating Scottish tweeds and woolen fabrics into its collections, a heritage detail that now conveniently aligned with the background of its newest face. Tennant's rootedness in Scotland, which was personal and genuine, became symbolic in Chanel's framing. Her identity was doing double duty, serving her own story and the house's simultaneously. Then came the workload. She wasn't floating through fashion on mystique. She was everywhere, season after season, trusted to hold a runway and to carry campaigns without turning herself into a cartoon. The industry treated her like a tool it could rely on, and she kept proving it right, even as her image stayed difficult to pin down. And she wasn't exclusive to one aesthetic. Vogue's obituary specified that she walked major Alexander McQueen presentations, The Hunger, in spring 1996, and La Poupée in spring 1997, shows that lived in a completely different emotional register than Chanel's polished elegance. McQueen's work was raw, confrontational, theatrical. Tennant moved between these worlds fluently. British Vogue's tributes called her the ultimate chameleon, a model whose presence could serve wildly different creative visions without losing coherence. That range is what separated her from being a symbol attached to one house. She was an instrument the entire industry could tune to its needs. In 1999, she married David Lasnett in a small parish church in Oxnam in the Scottish borders, keeping it intentionally quiet. She wore helmet lang, minimal, modern, and unmistakably her. The choice matched the tone. No spectacle for the industry, just a private decision that belonged to her life. The domestic life that followed became, in its own way, as documented as her runway career. though in a completely different register. The family settled in the Scottish borders, the same landscape that had shaped Tennant's childhood. The Guardian's obituary described a home with a vegetable garden and chickens, and it framed Tennant as Scottish first, someone whose primary identity was rooted in place, not in the fashion capitals that still needed her seasonally. She and Lasnett had children. The rhythms of rural family life, school runs, seasons, soil, weather that doesn't care about collection schedules, replaced the rhythms of Fashion Week, or at least competed with them. For someone whose professional life depended on being precisely where the industry wanted her, precisely when it wanted her there, this was a deliberate choice to build a life organized around a different clock. But she didn't disappear. This is where the tension gets interesting. Tennant continued working selectively throughout the 2000s and 2010s, describing her ongoing fashion career as a part-time job. The language is deliberate and possibly protective, framing continued involvement as something casual, manageable, under control. A part-time job is something you do on your schedule, something that serves your life rather than consuming it. Whether that framing matched the reality of what was being asked of her, the travel, the fittings, the pressure of performing an image at the highest level, is a question the public record can't fully answer. What's clear is that the industry kept reaching for her, and she kept answering. In 2006, Burberry cast her alongside Kate in a major autumn-winter campaign shot by Mario Testino. British Vogue described the pairing as a family affair. This wasn't a nostalgia booking. Tennant was an active participant in one of Britain's most prominent fashion campaigns, positioned alongside the most famous model of her generation. The gap between part-time and Burberry campaign with Kate Moss is the kind of gap that only makes sense if you understand how the fashion industry works. It doesn't let go of the people it values, and the people it values learn to manage the tension between being wanted and wanting to be left alone. The question the middle of her life raises is one she may have been asking herself for years. Is it possible to hold both worlds, the quiet Scottish life and the visibility machine, without one eventually swallowing the other? She built fences between them. She controlled the terms. She chose when to step back into the frame and when to stay in the garden. For 2 decades, it appeared to work. Her Scotland years weren't a disappearance. They were a redirect. In 2016, she co-designed an autumn-winter collection with heritage outfitter Holland & Holland alongside fashion editor Isabella Cawdor, pushing the work toward comfort, utility, and pieces that made sense outside a studio. She approached it like someone who'd worn clothes as a job and finally wanted to build them for real life. The point wasn't to chase a designer label identity. It was to make something practical and exact. Separately, she and her sister, a gilder by training, ran a studio in the Scottish borders called Tennant & Tennant. House and Garden profiled the operation in detail. Gilded objects and furniture inspired by nature and memory, including pieces connected to Chatsworth. The magazine described the collaboration as a merger of her sister's decorative arts background and Tennant's three-dimensional design sensibility. The sculpture training from Winchester resurfacing years later in a completely different context. Some of the pieces they produced ended up back at Chatsworth, the ancestral home where she'd been photographed by Bruce Weber alongside her grandmother years earlier. The geography of her life kept circling back to itself. She also founded Tennant & Son, a small brand producing hand-knit cashmere knitwear. The origin was practical, even domestic. She couldn't find children's clothes she actually liked, so she made them. Vogue's tribute confirmed the brand and its ethos. There was no grand launch, no celebrity endorsement campaign. It was a mother solving a problem and turning the solution into a craft. These ventures share a common direction. The woman who'd spent decades as a surface, a face, a body, an image controlled by photographers and designers and brand strategists who needed her to embody their ideas, was now producing tangible objects, gilded furniture, knitted garments, functional clothing designed for people who live outside, who walk, through mud and weather. The trajectory from her sculpture degree to these projects traces a line that modeling interrupted but never erased. She'd always wanted to make things. Fashion had mostly wanted to make things of her. In August 2019, Tennant did something that put her in direct tension with the industry that had built her career. She lent her name and her image to Oxfam's Secondhand September, a campaign asking people to commit to buying no new clothes for an entire month and to purchase secondhand instead. For a woman who had spent a quarter century as the visual engine of new collections, new seasons, new desires, this was a significant public pivot. The Guardian interviewed her about the decision. Her framing was careful and self-implicating. She didn't position herself above the problem. She didn't claim to have always known better. After 25 years in fashion, she said, people needed to think harder about how they consume. Fashion, she acknowledged, is designed to manufacture desire. That's the engine, and she'd been part of it. The work now was to interrupt that cycle, to slow the machinery down, even while standing inside it. Oxfam's own press materials carried direct quotes. Tennant stated that secondhand purchasing could help slow down fast fashion, a phrase that, by 2019, had become shorthand for the environmental and ethical costs of disposable clothing production. Her daughter appeared alongside her in the campaign's photo shoot and spoke in explicitly ethical terms about climate and shopping habits, a generational handoff of concern that gave the advocacy a personal dimension. Here was a woman who had walked runways for Lagerfeld, standing next to her child and talking about buying less. The campaign mattered because she didn't present herself as spotless. She'd spent decades helping the industry sell new as a need, and then she used her own face to tell people to step back from that reflex. That's a hard pivot for anyone, especially someone whose image helped power the cycle for so long. And it's why the message landed as more than a trend. In December 2018, Stephen Meisel photographed Stella Tennant for the cover of British Vogue. 25 years after the Spitalfields shoot that launched her career, the same photographer and the same magazine chose to bring the story full circle. The echo was deliberate, a visual callback to December 1993, staged a quarter century later with a woman who had aged on her own terms. In her accompanying essay for that issue, Tennant reflected on the first job, describing it as something that happened by accident. The phrase is disarming in its simplicity. An entire career, Chanel campaigns, McQueen runways, Olympic ceremonies, reduced to a single contingency. She didn't chase it. It arrived, and she decided to walk through the door. Then, in January 2020, Tennant walked Valentino Haute Couture in Paris. Fashion Network's Runway review reported her appearing in a black dress topped by an organza blouse. Retrospective coverage identified this as her final runway appearance. She was 49 years old, weeks from turning 50, still commanding a couture stage in a world that routinely discards models before they reach 30. The booking itself was a statement of her standing. Valentino Haute Couture is not a sentimental exercise. It's one of the most exclusive runways in fashion. They chose her because she could still carry it. 2 years earlier, she'd appeared in another kind of spotlight entirely. During the closing ceremony of the 2012 London Olympics, a segment celebrating British fashion featured a live catwalk moment organized by British Vogue's editor Alexandra Shulman, fashion director Lucinda Chambers, photographer Nick Knight, hairdresser Sam McKnight, and makeup artist Val Garland. Tennant walked in a metal mesh and Swarovski crystal trouser suit designed by Christopher Kane. A global audience watched a woman who had spent her life moving between a Scottish farmhouse and Parisian catwalks, chosen to represent British fashion's identity on the world's largest stage. The choice was pointed. Of all the models Britain could have sent down that runway, they sent the one who had spent her career complicating what British fashion meant. These late career moments share a quality. Each time the industry reached for her, the Vogue cover, the Valentino show, the Olympic ceremony, it was reaching for something it couldn't manufacture from scratch. 3 decades of credibility built on refusal, range, and selective presence. She kept answering the call, and the calls kept coming. On 22 December 2020, 5 days after her 50th birthday, Stella Tennant died at her home in Scotland. Reuters reported the death and confirmed that police said there were no suspicious circumstances. Her family released a statement through the Press Association asking for privacy and announcing that arrangements for a memorial would follow. In January 2021, the family provided a second statement. Tennant had taken her own life. She had been unwell for some time. Those 9 words, "she had been unwell for some time," were chosen with precision. They indicate prolonged struggle, not a sudden crisis. They point to something ongoing, something that existed beneath the surface while she was still walking runways and photographing campaigns, and appearing in Oxfam releases with her daughter. The family's decision to make the cause of death public was itself a deliberate act. A source connected to the family told The Guardian that the motivation was to raise awareness around misunderstood mental health. They named the problem at a structural level, the way mental illness is misread, underestimated, or made invisible by the people suffering it and the people around them. They did not name a diagnosis, a single trigger, or a timeline. The space they left open was intentional, and responsible narration stops where their language stops. At the time of her death, police said there were no suspicious circumstances. Weeks later, her family released a second statement saying she had taken her own life and had been unwell for some time. They didn't turn it into a public diagnosis or a neat explanation, and that restraint matters, because the story doesn't get to invent the missing pieces. The fashion world's response was immediate and voluminous. British Vogue published extensive tributes compiling statements from designers, photographers, editors, and fellow models. The recurring words were not about her beauty or her body. They described her as kind, professional, irreplaceable. They emphasized how she made collaborators feel, on, set, and off, an angle that moves her legacy beyond the visual archive and into something harder to photograph, the quality of her presence in a room. Several tributes noted her humor, her lack of pretension, the way she could shift between a couture fitting and a conversation about her garden without any sense of performance. She was, by multiple accounts, precisely the same person in both settings. The mourning itself became a kind of mirror, an industry that celebrated Tennant for her warmth, her discipline, and her ability to sustain decades of work at the highest level, was also an industry with documented structural pressures on the people inside it. Peer-reviewed research has described models as a high-risk group for mental health challenges, with many avoiding help for fear of professional consequences. The British Fashion Council's own 2007 inquiry into model health, which included the Council of Fashion Designers of America's Health Initiative emphasizing education and healthier backstage environments, acknowledged these concerns publicly. None of that evidence explains what happened to Stella Tennant specifically. Her story belongs to her and to her family, but the world she worked in is not separate from the pressures it places on the people who populate it. Stella Tennant's career began with a refusal, a 23-year-old keeping a piece of metal in her nose because no one had earned the right to ask her to remove it. That gesture contained everything that followed. Over the next 27 years, that founding impulse echoed through every significant decision she made. The way she moved between Scotland and Paris without apologizing for either. The way she turned decades of being photographed into a life of making objects with her hands. The way she stood in front of a camera for Oxfam and said publicly that the industry she'd served was part of a problem she wanted to help solve. The fashion world loved what she represented. An aristocrat who dressed like a punk, a runway presence who preferred farm life, a face that could sell Chanel and open a McQueen show in the same week without contradiction. She held it together for a long time. She held it together by controlling the terms, choosing when to appear, when to retreat, when to speak, and when to stay quiet. She built a home in the borders. She raised children. She made furniture and knitwear and clothes designed for people who live outside, not people who walk under studio lights. And when the weight of sustaining that distance became too much, the world she'd moved through for 3 decades mourned her with a sincerity that suggested they'd understood, all along, that what she carried was heavier than it looked. What Stella Tennant proved across 27 years is that the most compelling presence in fashion belongs to someone who doesn't need it. What she couldn't prove, because no one can, is that you can live permanently between 2 worlds without paying a cost for the crossing. That cost is not a lesson. It's not a moral. It's the part of her story that belongs to no one but her.